Do you honestly think a low-life electrician, reeking of grease and kerosene, has the right to step through the level 5 security door of this building? Get out of here before I call security and have you thrown into a jail cell for criminal trespassing. The head of cybersecurity for the city's largest financial conglomerate barked, his voice sharp and dripping with absolute contempt as he glared at the middle-aged man standing in the lobby, adjusting his frayed collar. But he had no idea that in exactly 35 minutes, the very multi-million-dollar security network he took such pride in, a state-of-the-art automated system driven by the world's most advanced artificial intelligence, would turn into a useless pile of scrap metal. On the massive LED screen, hanging in the center of the control room, the crimson countdown numbers kept ticking down coldly. 39 minutes, 58 seconds. 39 minutes, 57 seconds. The entire core server system, containing the transaction data of over 10 million banking accounts worldwide, was trapped in a state of complete lockdown. The power supply voltage dropped inexplicably, triggering a chain reaction of micro-circuit explosions in the auxiliary optical disc cabinets. The elite team of foreign experts, high-level engineers hired at tens of thousands of dollars a month, were now frantically pounding on their keyboards, sweat pouring down their foreheads and blurring their glasses. They were completely helpless. Every single line of code they entered was met with the exact same system error, critical unidentified hardware conflict. If the backup battery drained completely before the power stabilized, all flash memory would automatically wipe itself to prevent data leaks, which meant the corporation would vanish. Hundreds of millions of dollars in compensation, triggering the collapse of a financial empire. In the dark corner of the technical corridor, the man wearing a faded plastic nametag, 01 David, stood in absolute silence. He didn't look at the complex lines of code racing wildly across the monitors. His eyes were locked instead on the LED phase indicator lights on the main electrical panel, which were blinking in a highly unusual rhythm. "That is not a software glitch," David whispered under his breath, his hand tightening around the handle of his rusted iron toolbox, which held crude hand tools that the modern tech industry considered useless garbage of the past century. He knew exactly what was happening inside those 3-meter-thick concrete walls, something that no AI algorithm could ever scan. Right at that moment, heavy and urgent footsteps echoed from the executive elevator, and the Supreme Chief Executive Officer of the conglomerate stepped out, his face pale, but his eyes retaining the sharp edge of a powerful leader. He brushed the arrogant head of security aside, looking straight at the only poor electrician standing in a room full of paralyzed geniuses. "Get him into the main server room right now, by any means necessary," the CEO commanded, his voice trembling with sheer desperation. 6 hours before the alarms paralyzed the heart of the financial district, David sat in his cramped apartment, the heavy silence of the room broken only by the steady tick of an old wall clock. The air smelled faintly of cheap laundry detergent, and the copper tang of old circuit boards scattered across his work table. With practiced care, his calloused thumbs gently wiped a thin layer of dust from a small, plastic device, an outdated hearing aid that had seen better days. He turned to the small bed in the corner, where his 7-year-old daughter, Lily, lay fast asleep, her face peaceful and oblivious to the silent world she inhabited. David's chest tightened as he looked at the medical estimate lying open on the table, $3,000 for a new, medical-grade, digital hearing aid. To a high-tech conglomerate, that sum was less than a rounding error. But to a 42-year-old manual technician recently downsized from his company, it felt like an insurmountable mountain. They had told him his decades of physical infrastructure knowledge were obsolete, replaced by smart grid sensors and automated diagnostics that didn't require a man with a heavy toolbox. His hand shook slightly as he set the hearing aid down, knowing the landlord would be knocking for the overdue rent in less than 48 hours. Suddenly, the harsh vibration of his old mobile phone rattled against the wooden table, the screen lighting up with the name of Marcus, a former coworker who now worked night shift security at the downtown data fortress. "David, you need to grab your analog kit and get down here immediately." Marcus' voice came through the receiver, low and frantic. "The auxiliary cooling pumps in the sub-basement are cycling strangely, and the automated maintenance contractors won't touch the manual transfer switches because they aren't on the digital blueprints. They're offering a double-rate emergency cash payout for a field tech who knows how to handle legacy high-voltage switchgear without tripping the main breakers. David looked back at Lily, then at the $3,000 figure glaring at him from the medical form. He pulled on his sword-faded canvas jacket, lifted the heavy iron toolbox that had belonged to his father, and stepped out into the freezing midnight air. When David arrived at the service entrance of the towering glass skyscraper, the freezing wind cut through his thin canvas jacket, but his grip on the rusted toolbox remained steady. Marcus met him at the security gate, his face pale, as he quickly swiped David through the turnstiles, bypassing the standard visitor registration. But their hurried progress was abruptly halted at the threshold of the main technical atrium by the head of cybersecurity, who was flanked by two burly guards. "What is this garbage doing in my facility?" the manager spat, pointing an accusing finger at David's oil-stained work boots and the ancient iron box in his hand. "We are dealing with a critical infrastructure anomaly, not a residential blown fuse. Get this peasant out of my sight before I have him arrested." David did not look at the man's expensive tailored suit or his flashing gold badge. Instead, his eyes drifted to the walls. He could feel a faint, high-frequency vibration radiating through the soles of his boots, a microtremor in the structural concrete that signaled an immense, unstable load. Suddenly, a violent spike rattled through the facility, and every overhead fluorescent light fixture died simultaneously, plunged into an eerie, emergency crimson glow. The automated system screamed as three major secondary drive arrays went completely dark, sending a shockwave of panic through the room. The foreign experts began shouting over one another, their fingers flying across terminal keyboards as error logs cascaded down their monitors like a digital avalanche. "The A diagnostics are completely frozen," the lead engineer yelled in a thick accent. "It keeps reporting a phantom data loop, but the physical fiber lines are perfectly intact." David walked slowly toward the primary power distribution cabinet, ignoring the security guards, who were too frozen in panic to stop him. He reached out and placed his bare, scar-lined palm flat against the cold metal casing of the high-voltage housing, closing his eyes to isolate the sensation. The digital displays on the panel were flickering erratically, showing a massive voltage drop, yet the thermal cameras showed the processors were overheating at a catastrophic rate. "This isn't a software virus, and it isn't a hacker attack," David said, his calm, low voice cutting through the chaotic shouting of the elite engineers. "Your $1 million AI is blind to what's happening right under your feet, and if you don't shut down the primary laser security grid in the next 2 minutes, the magnetic feedback will cook every single master drive into charcoal." The head of cybersecurity let out a harsh, mocking laugh, stepping directly into David's path to block him from the panel. "You expect us to shut down a $1 million defensive laser perimeter based on the gut feeling of a man who looks like he belongs in a scrapyard. Don't touch that equipment, you bakali mechanic. Your entire net worth wouldn't cover the cost of a single copper busbar in this room." But David didn't move an inch, his face remaining as unreadable as stone as the crimson countdown clock shifted to 28 minutes. Just then, the Supreme Chief Executive Officer stepped forward, his eyes fixed on David's calloused, grease-stained hands. The CEO had spent 40 years building this financial empire from the ground up, and he knew the difference between a panicked fraud and a master craftsman. "Shut down the laser grid," the CEO commanded, his voice dead, calm but carrying a weight that brooked no argument. The security manager gasped, "But sir, our external protocols demand." "I said shut it down," the CEO roared, turning his back on the manager to look David dead in the eye. The lead engineer slammed his palm onto the emergency override sequence, and with a heavy, mechanical thud, the invisible laser grid vanished. Instantly, the violent vibration in the floorboards began to damp down, and the rising thermal alarms on the server stacks plateaued. The room fell into a stunned, breathless silence as the elite tech team stared at their monitors in absolute disbelief. "How did you know that would work?" the CEO asked, his voice shaking slightly as he took a step closer to the poor technician. David knelt down beside his rusted iron toolbox, unlatching the heavy metal clasps with a loud, echoey click. because your software only measures what's inside the wires, but it doesn't understand the physical foundation of the ground they sit on, David replied. 20 years ago, when the bedrock of this vault was poured, the old-school municipal crew buried a 3-inch solid copper grounding line directly beneath this floor. Your modern digital schematics left it off the map because they assumed legacy hardware didn't matter anymore. But right now, an underground high-voltage transit line outside this building is leaking raw current into the damp foundation wall. The electricity is traveling through the concrete, hitting that forgotten copper ground, and feeding straight up into your digital servers through the back door. The AI thinks it's a data loop attack, so it keeps drawing more power to defend itself, which is exactly what's cooking your hardware from the inside out. The cybersecurity manager's face twisted in rage as he realized his authority was completely evaporating in front of the entire staff. This is absolute nonsense, he said, stepping toward the guards. He's just spinning a fairy tale to cover up the fact that he has no legal certification to touch this hardware. He's trying to sabotage the facility. Cuff him and drag him out of here before he does any more damage to our reputation. The 2 large security guards hesitated, looking between their immediate superior and the grim expression of the chief executive officer. "Do not move a muscle," the CEO said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that instantly froze the guards in their tracks. "Turn around and look at the secondary diagnostic board. You arrogant fool. Look at what the analog sensors are telling us." The room turned to look at a small, outdated hardware panel in the corner, one of the few pieces of equipment not connected to the main AI node. A mechanical needle on a physical dial was vibrating violently, pinned deep into the danger zone, completely corroborating David's theory. Suddenly, a massive, brilliant blue arc of electricity shot out from the rear of the main power transformer cabinet with a deafening crack. Thick, acrid black smoke began to pour from the ventilation grates, and the internal temperature of the server housing spiked by another 15 degrees. The emergency sirens shifted from a rhythmic pulse to a continuous, piercing shriek that rattled the glass partitions of the executive suite. The backup battery display blinked rapidly, the numbers dropping with terrifying speed as the short circuit devoured the remaining power. 17 minutes, 24 seconds. 17 minutes, 23 seconds. "We're losing the cooling fans completely." The lead engineer panicked, shielding his face from the rising heat. "The core processors are going to liquefy. If the temperature hits 85 degrees, the automated self-destruct protocol will wipe every encryption key, and we will lose everything." The CEO turned back to David, his hands trembling as he reached out, abandoning every ounce of corporate pride he possessed. "I don't care about certificates, and I don't care about protocols," the old billionaire pleaded, his voice cracking under the weight of ruin. "Please, my friend, tell me what we need to do to stop this. Save my company, and you can name your own price." David pulled a thick pair of worn leather high-voltage gloves from his rusted iron box, his face completely devoid of fear. "The only way to stop the feedback is to physically isolate the legacy foundation ground from the modern digital distribution network," David said. "But the main isolator switch is locked inside the old mechanical vault behind the transformer, and it hasn't been opened in 15 years. The automated system has locked the electronic deadbolts due to the fire hazard, meaning no computer in this world can open that door now. I have to go in there manually through the high-voltage crawl space and cut the main copper ground line by hand before the current cooks us all." The cybersecurity manager stepped forward, his voice cracking with desperation as he tried to regain control of the room. "You cannot let this man go into the high-voltage crawl space. It is a direct violation of international safety protocols, and our insurance policy will be completely void. If he makes one mistake, he will detonate the primary substation and level the lower half of this entire skyscraper." David didn't even look back at the manager as he pulled a heavy, manual hacksaw from the bottom of his rusted iron toolbox. He checked the tension of the carbon steel blade, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small tub of thick, dark industrial grease. The elite engineers watched in total confusion as David began smearing the heavy grease thick along the teeth of the saw blade. "What on earth is he doing?" the lead engineer whispered, wiping sweat from his eyes. Grease on a saw blade will slow down the cutting speed by half. He doesn't understand modern friction dynamics. He's going to run out of time. David stood before the narrow, metal maintenance hatch that led into the high-voltage crawl space, the air venting out of it smelling heavily of ozone and burning copper. He looked at the CEO, his eyes calm, reflecting the spinning red emergency lights of the command center. "The grease isn't for friction," David said, his voice steady and quiet against the roar of the alarms. "When you cut through a live, highly charged, 3-inch copper ground bar under heavy magnetic load, the friction creates microsparks. In a room filling with acrid insulation smoke, a single spark will ignite the airborne gas and cause a catastrophic flashover explosion. The grease catches the copper filings and smothers the oxygen at the cutting point, preventing the spark from ever forming. Your digital manuals don't teach you that because they assume you always cut the power from a clean, safe desktop screen." The CEO stood frozen, a sudden wave of profound respect washing over him as he realized this manual worker possessed a level of practical wisdom that no university degree could ever replicate. "Do what you have to do," the CEO said, stepping forward to personally unlatch the heavy manual iron bars of the hatch. David took a deep breath, adjusted his worn leather gloves, and crawled into the narrow, pitch-black space beneath the humming transformers. The temperature inside was suffocating, the raw voltage in the air making the hairs on his arms stand up even through his heavy canvas jacket. He could hear his phone vibrating in his pocket, a timed reminder he had set hours ago to check on his daughter Lily and give her medicine. He thought of her face, waiting for him in that cold, silent apartment, relying on him to bring home the money that would allow her to hear his voice again. He squeezed his eyes shut against the stinging smoke, dragged himself toward the thick, glowing copper bar, and pressed the greased saw blade against the live metal. The steady, rhythmic sound of metal grinding against metal echoed through the narrow, suffocating high-voltage crawl space. Ket, ket, ket. Outside, in the main command center, the elite technical team held their breath, their eyes glued to the countdown clock. 6 minutes, 42 seconds. 6 minutes, 41 seconds. The air inside the hatch was thick, with a toxic mixture of burning plastic and ozone, making David's lungs burn with every shallow breath he took. His hands, heavily insulated by the thick leather gloves, were throbbing from the immense physical strain of forcing the saw blade through 3 inches of solid, dense copper. The thick industrial grease he had smeared onto the blade was working perfectly, trapping the glowing metal filings before they could ignite the highly volatile, smoky air. But the resistance was brutal, and the heavy, magnetic feedback from the leaking city current was pushing back against the steel blade, making it vibrate violently against his grip. A sudden, massive surge rattled the primary transformer cabinet right above his head, sending a cascade of bright blue static sparks dancing across the concrete floor. David flinched as a jolt of raw static energy bypassed his sleeve and snapped against his bare wrist, sending a blinding wave of pain straight up his arm. He dropped the saw, his fingers locking up in a painful, involuntary muscle spasm as he gasped for clean air in the darkness. He slumped against the vibrating wall, his vision blurring as the heat began to cloud his conscious mind. He could hear the faint, muffled sound of the sirens outside, a distant reminder that time was slipping away from him. He reached into his jacket pocket with his trembling left hand, his fingers brushing against the cold, smooth plastic of Lily's outdated hearing aid. He remembered the silent tears on her face when she tried to understand his bedtime stories, her tiny hands reaching out to touch his lips just to feel the vibrations of the words she couldn't hear. $3,000, he whispered to himself, his voice raspy and broken in the dark chamber. I am not leaving this building without that money, and I am not letting my little girl spend another day locked in a silent world. With a roar of pure determination, David forced his locked fingers back around the handle of the hacksaw, gritting his teeth against the searing pain in his arm. He placed the blade back into the grooved cut, threw his entire body weight into the motion, and began sawing with a ferocious, unrelenting speed. Ket, ket. The lead engineer in the control room screamed out. The temperature at the server core has just hit 84 degrees. We have less than 90 seconds before the automatic purge initiates. The CEO closed his eyes, clenching his fists so hard, his knuckles turned white, silently praying for the life of the brave man buried under the floorboards. Then, with a sudden, deafening mechanical snap that echoed like a gunshot through the sub-basement, the tension in the floor vanished. The thick copper grounding line parted completely. Instantly, the violent, high-frequency vibration in the concrete floor died down to a complete, absolute dead stop. A heavy, breathless silence fell over the entire multi-million-dollar command center as the bright red emergency lights suddenly flickered and died. For 3 long, agonizing seconds, the room remained plunged in pitch darkness, the only sound being the rapid, panicked breathing of the elite tech team. Then, with a deep, resonant hum, the primary circuit breakers cycled back to life, and the overhead fluorescent fixtures illuminated the room in a crisp, bright white light. The piercing fire sirens dropped to a gentle, rhythmic beep before turning off completely, and the deafening roar of the cooling fans settled into a smooth, mechanical purr. On the master diagnostic console, the cascading red error logs instantly vanished, replaced by a single, solid green bar that stretched across the main screen. System status, stable. Power grid efficiency, 100%. Database integrity, fully restored. The lead engineer stared at his monitor, his mouth hanging wide open as he practically fell back into his ergonomic leather chair. Every single byte of transaction data has been saved, he whispered, his voice trembling as he looked up at the board. The encryption keys are fully intact. The core temperature is dropping back to normal operating levels. It's a complete recovery. The entire room erupted into a chaotic wave of cheers and applause, with tech experts hugging one another and wiping tears of pure relief from their faces. But the chief executive officer didn't look at the monitors, and he didn't join in the celebration. His eyes remained locked on the iron maintenance hatch in the corner of the room, which was still venting a faint, lazy spiral of white insulation smoke. With his own hands, the elderly billionaire grabbed the heavy iron handles, unlatching the lock and pulling the reinforced metal door open with a loud screech. David crawled out slowly, his sword-faded canvas jacket covered in thick black soot, and his worn leather gloves completely shredded from the intense mechanical friction. His face was streaked with sweat and grime, and he was coughing heavily from the toxic ozone gas, but his eyes were steady, calm, and unbroken. He set his rusted iron toolbox down on the polished white marble floor with a heavy, metallic clatter, then slowly unpeeled the ruined leather gloves from his throbbing hands. The CEO stepped forward, ignoring the soot and grease, and reached out to grasp David's burned wrist, his voice thick with a profound, unscripted emotion. "You did it, my friend. You saved everything I spent my entire life building," the old man said, his eyes gleaming with tears of immense gratitude. David simply nodded, wiping a streak of black grease from his forehead with the back of his sleeve as he looked toward the exit. "I just came here to do the job I was hired for," David replied, his voice low and raspy. "Now if the facility is secure, I need to collect my emergency cash payment and go home to my daughter." Before David could even pick up his heavy iron toolbox, the cybersecurity manager pushed his way through the crowd of celebrating engineers. His expensive silk tie was crooked, and his face was flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and lingering malice as he looked at the ruined copper bar on the diagnostic screen. "This is highly irregular," the manager stammered, pointing a shaking finger at David. "Yes, the system is back online, but this man has caused thousands of dollars in property damage to our legacy infrastructure. Furthermore, he intentionally bypassed our digital firewall protocols and created a massive safety hazard by operating an uninsulated cutting tool in a restricted zone. For all we know, he could have engineered this entire power fluctuation himself, just to slip into the facility and extort us for money. I want this man detained, his toolbox confiscated for a full forensic analysis, and his payment withheld until legal counsel reviews the incident." The elite engineers in the room fell into a disgusted, stunned silence, staring at the manager with absolute disbelief. David didn't say a word, nor did his expression change. Simply stood there, an island of calm dignity in a sea of corporate pettiness. He reached into his pocket, took out a small, oil-stained piece of paper, and laid it flat on the pristine white marble desk, right in front of the manager. It was a physical inspection tag from the high-voltage municipal cable that had leaked the electricity into the foundation. "Look at the signature and the corporate stamp on the back of that document," David said, his voice quiet but echoing with an undeniable authority. 3 months ago, a subcontracting company was paid $80,000 to install a magnetic shielding wrap around that specific transit line to prevent this exact type of environmental ground leakage. The company that signed off on that work, the company that claimed the shielding was fully installed and certified, is registered under your wife's maiden name. You didn't pay for safety shielding. You paid for a cheap plastic tarp, pocketed the remaining corporate funds, and left this facility sitting on a ticking time bomb. I didn't engineer your disaster. You built it yourself out of greed, and your multi-million-dollar AI couldn't detect it because you manually whitelisted your own subcontractors' faulty hardware data. The manager's face drained of color instantly, turning a ghostly, sickly white as the room turned to glare at him. The lead engineer quickly tapped a few keys on his console, pulling up the subcontractor records from the secure database. He's right, the engineer gasped, looking up in horror. The whitelisted hardware ID matches the manager's private security keys. The fraud is completely documented, right here in the system log. The chief executive officer turned slowly to look at his security manager, his eyes burning with a cold, terrifying fury that made the guards step back. "Take his badge, remove him from my building, and hand over every piece of data on his personal devices to the Federal Fraud Division immediately," the CEO commanded, his voice vibrating with absolute power. As the guards grabbed the screaming manager by the arms and dragged him out of the room, the old billionaire turned back to David, a look of profound humility replacing the anger on his face. The chief executive officer slowly walked over to his executive desk, opened a sleek wooden box, and pulled out a golden pen alongside a blank corporate check. He signed his name firmly at the bottom, walked back over to David, and pressed the check into the poor electrician's calloused, blackened palm. "You just saved this company more than $200 million in damages, and you exposed a cancer within my own administration," the old billionaire said, his voice deep with emotion. "Write down any number you want on this check. Whatever it is, consider it paid. You have earned a lifetime of luxury for your family tonight." The elite engineers stared in absolute awe, some of them nodding in approval, knowing that the man standing before them deserved every single penny. David looked down at the blank check in his hand. Then he looked at the rusted iron toolbox sitting on the marble floor. He thought about the $3,000 medical estimate for Lily's new digital hearing aid, and he thought about the overdue rent notice pinned to his refrigerator door. Slowly, under the stunned gazes of everyone in the room, David laid the check back down on the counter, picked up a standard blue pen, and wrote a single, precise figure in the amount line. $3,150. Exactly. The CEO frowned, completely bewildered by the small sum, looking between the check and the man's sword-faded canvas jacket. "What is the meaning of this?" the billionaire asked, his voice full of disbelief. "I offered you a fortune. Why would you only ask for this pocket change?" David picked up his heavy iron toolbox, lifting it with a steady, unbothered grace. $3,000 is the exact price of the medical device my daughter needs to hear her father's voice again," David replied, his voice quiet, but carrying a mountain of dignity. "And $150 is the exact standard fee for an emergency high-voltage, manual technical call-out in this city. I am an artisan, sir. I charge fairly for the true value of my labor and the knowledge my father passed down to me. I do not use a crisis to extort money. I did not earn through the sweat of my brow, and I do not need a handout from a corporation to prove my worth as a father." The old billionaire stood frozen, a sudden wave of profound humility washing over him as he realized this manual laborer possessed a level of honor and self-respect that no amount of wealth could ever buy. The CEO took the check back, tore it in half with a sharp snap, and immediately pulled a leather-bound folder from his jacket. "If you will not accept a handout, then you must accept a proper contract," the CEO said, his eyes filled with an unbreakable respect. "As of this moment, I am officially creating the position of Chief of Physical Infrastructure Security for this entire global financial network. You will have absolute authority over every cable, every transformer, and every foundation stone of our properties worldwide, with a starting salary of $250,000 a year. Your daughter will receive the finest medical care this city has to offer, fully covered by my personal executive fund, starting at 8 o'clock this morning. We have spent too many years relying on automated software that doesn't understand the real world, and I refuse to let a true master craftsman walk out of my life. David looked at the official contract, then at the sincere, pleading eyes of the old billionaire, who had finally learned to see the value in human hands. He reached out and shook the CEO's hand, a firm, binding grip between two men who understood what it meant to build an empire from nothing. By the time David stepped out of the heavy glass revolving doors of the towering data fortress, the first light of dawn was just beginning to break over the city skyline. The air was crisp and biting, carrying the sharp scent of morning rain and damp asphalt, a stark contrast to the suffocating heat of the high-voltage crawl space. The city was slowly waking up, street lamps flickering off one by one as the horizon turned a soft, gentle shade of amber and lavender. David walked down the concrete steps, his heavy iron toolbox swinging steadily by his side, its rhythmic metallic clank a familiar, comforting sound in the quiet morning. His body was exhausted, his muscles ached from the brutal physical strain of the saw, and his soot-stained face bore the marks of a long, sleepless battle. Yet as he looked up at the rising sun, a profound sense of peace washed over him, clearing away the lingering exhaustion of the night. For the first time in many months, the heavy, invisible weight that had been crushing his chest was completely gone. He boarded the early morning bus, sitting quietly near the back window as the vehicle rumbled through the familiar, waking streets of his neighborhood. He looked down at his calloused, grease-lined palms, the physical evidence of a lifetime of honest manual labor that had almost been deemed obsolete by a changing world. But his hands hadn't failed him. They had proven their worth, protecting his dignity and securing a future that only hours ago seemed like an impossible dream. When the bus pulled up to his stop, he stepped off and walked the final block toward his old apartment building, his footsteps lighter than they had been in years. He climbed the creaking wooden stairs, unlocked the door to his small apartment with a soft click, and stepped into the quiet warmth of his home. The apartment was still, illuminated by the gentle morning light, filtering through the sheer kitchen curtains. He quietly set his heavy iron toolbox down on the linoleum floor, taking care not to let it slam, and walked softly toward the small bedroom in the corner. Lily was just sitting up in her bed, rubbing her eyes as she woke up, her messy hair catching the golden sunlight streaming through the window. She looked up and saw her father standing in the doorway, his jacket covered in black soot but a wide, warm smile gracing his tired face. Her eyes lit up with pure joy as she scrambled out of her blankets and ran across the room, throwing her small arms tightly around his waist. David knelt down on the floor, holding his daughter close against his chest, burying his face in her hair as he breathed a sigh of absolute relief. He gently pulled back, reaching into his pocket to bring out the leather-bound executive folder the CEO had given him. Inside was the medical authorization, completely stamped and validated, ensuring that the finest specialist in the city would be waiting for them in just a few hours. He looked into Lily's deep, trusting eyes, then reached out to gently touch the side of her face, his thumbs brushing against her cheek. "You don't have to live in silence anymore, my beautiful girl," David said, his voice thick with an unscripted, overwhelming emotion as tears finally pricked his eyes. "You're going to hear the music, you're going to hear the rain, and you're always going to hear how much your father loves you." Lily couldn't hear the words, but as she looked at the tears tracking down through the soot on his face and felt the deep, steady vibration of his voice against her hands, she understood completely. She smiled, a brilliant, beautiful smile that chased away every dark shadow of the past, and pressed her forehead gently against his. In a world that rushes to replace the old with the new, we often forget that the foundation of everything we build is made of things you can touch, see, and feel. We build complex algorithms. We delegate our choices to code, automated intelligence, and we convince ourselves that The human hand is no longer required to keep the wheels turning. But a machine can only measure what it has been programmed to see. It cannot feel the subtle tremor in the stone. It cannot smell the rising ozone of a hidden crisis. And it possesses no honor to defend. True wisdom does not live in a digital cloud or a certified piece of paper. It lives in the callouses of a worker's palms, the quiet dignity of an honest trade, and the lengths a father will go to protect his child. The grand structures of our modern society are only as strong as the unseen men who know how to keep the lines grounded when the storm hits. When the systems fail and the screens go dark, it is not an abstract formula that will crawl into the smoke to save us. It is the master craftsman with an iron box and a heart full of purpose. If you were put in David's shoes, standing before a blank check that could change your life, would you have the strength to write down only what you earned, or would you let the wealth change who you are? How much is your integrity worth when everything you love is on the line? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and remember to look at the quiet laborers around you with a little more respect today. Thank you for watching Dad Life Stories, where the real value of a man is never defined by his price, but by his actions.